our first shot at having intellectual conversations. In the future, we want to have debates. We'll pick specific topics on maybe pipelines or whatever is current at the time, bring in debaters. And this was our first crack, and John happened to be in Edmonton at an event, and he agreed to come out and help us take our first shot at intellectual conversation. Just as a short introduction to John, then I'll let him get started. John is a documentary filmmaker and columnist with the National Post and a commentator at large for the News Talk Radio 580 CFR in Ottawa. He's also an invited professor at the University of Ottawa, and John also holds a PhD in American history from the University of Texas in Austin. So help me welcome John Robson for his talk.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming out to what I believe is a very important and also a very encouraging topic to start off this series. The topic is taking Canada back with a smile, or Magna Carta for the whole family. And I'm more or less going to do the first part, and Brigitte will do the second part. Although our documentary on Magna Carta was for and by the whole family, as she did much of the filming and the editing, and we had production assistance from our children who, we need a slide change here. My assistant here, we can't do anything without the technology. As you now know, there are at least 6 devices whose failure could plunge us into darkness and silence. So we did, in fact, do the documentary with the whole family as well as for the whole family. And if we're able to get to the next slide, you will see that at the very least, our children have developed a firm opinion on Bad King John. The question, did he deserve to be called Bad King John? The answer is no. He was much worse than that. Now, this documentary, next slide, although it was an examination of a document that was sealed 800 years ago, was not so much a voyage into the past as it was an examination of the strong foundations upon which Canada was created, and a call to take back our heritage, to become again a nation founded on Magna Carta. And it's part of a larger project, this idea of taking back our heritage. The next project that we are engaged on is on Canadians' right to self-defense. And it's another one of our Thinking Big documentaries that looks at the long scope of Canadian history and starts by asking this fundamental question: what kind of people are Canadians? Are we independent, self-reliant, able to look out for ourselves and for one another? Or are we people who may be charming, even quaint, but cannot be allowed to go about the business of life in our economic affairs, in our family affairs, and in our community affairs without the wise and guiding hand of an overarching state? And then we had plans to work on a documentary on fixing the Constitution somewhat later in this year, but then we found a funding partner in the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom and decided we'd go with a third in the series at the same time. So we thought, we were always telling people to think big, don't be afraid and go for it. And so we applied it to ourselves and said, yes, we'll do that one as well. And if you are interested in this, you can find more details at fixtheconstitution.ca, and we have material that will be available in the break that explains how you can get more on that project. All of these have the premise that Canadians are born free and Canadians should be free. We're not afraid, including we're not afraid to be laughed at, because some people do laugh at that, but we also know our history, and that is the history of this country. To take one example, the next slide, the rule of law. In Magna Carta, it says very expressly and in some detail that nobody shall be imprisoned nor have anything that is rightfully theirs taken away except by the lawful judgment of their equals and the law of the land. And one of the critical clauses in Magna Carta, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. And this, of course, is one of the ways in which the system now is falling down. The legal system does not sell justice in the sense of being corrupt. You can't go bribing judges in Canada. But it's very, very expensive. Justice is increasingly out of reach of the ordinary person, and it is delayed. Legal proceedings take years. And this grinds you down so badly that even if you win, you feel like you lost. And that is not how a fair system of liberty under law ought to operate. And this rule of law, it's one of the things that everybody will praise in their stump speeches on Canada. And it is, of course, contained in the preamble to the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God. I don't know how that got in there. That was actually Pierre Trudeau's handiwork, believe it or not. And the rule of law, that this principle that's in Magna Carta in 1215 is still integral to how our society works. So people do, in some sense, understand that we're still based upon these fundamentals. And as we say in the documentary, this idea of building a society upon the rule of law and guarantees of individual rights, it's not just one way to build a decent society. It's not as though there are 10 or 12 different ways people have found to do it and we just happen to like this one. It's the only way that has ever been found. The only kind of society that really works, that has a flourishing economy, that has a dynamic culture, that is able to defend itself from external threats, is one that is built upon that foundation, in which individuals have inherent rights. The law binds the state, and the people stand above the rulers. That's what liberty under law means, and it is a very old idea. Even Magna Carta is not a document that created this system. It's a document that defended this system. I like to quote a book that was written by John of Salisbury, who was at the court of King Henry II, almost a century before Magna Carta. And in his book, Polycraticus, he wrote, "The difference between the prince and the tyrant is that the prince obeys the law and governs his people in accordance with right." And it's a very interesting sentiment, because at the time that he's writing, there are not laws made by Parliament because there aren't parliaments. And he says the prince obeys the law, so the law is not what the king says the law is. Where then does it come from? How can there be law? Who is making the law? And the answer is the people, the common law of England, the rules under which the English consent to be governed. And in Polycraticus, John also writes, it is lawful and just to slay the tyrant. So here he is at the court of a medieval king saying, if you take away our rights, we will kill you. How do you like that, Your Majesty? This is not something you should try at the court of the Russian Tsar. This is definitely not something you should try in front of Genghis Khan. He would laugh, but he would be laughing at his plans to dismember you for having uttered such an impudent statement. But in England, you can say this to the king in the 12th century, and he goes, yep, unfortunately, you've nailed it. And that's the spirit that led to Runnymede and to Magna Carta. And if you look at Magna Carta in translation, because the original is in rather crabbed Latin, one of the things you find there in the next slide is property rights. In 1215, property rights are constitutionally entrenched in England. No constable or other royal official shall take corn or other movable goods from any man without immediate payment. That was in Magna Carta. It should have been in our 1982 Constitution. Polls indicated that people wanted it, but the politicians didn't, and it was left out. Magna Carta, to many people's surprise, also includes women's rights, because King John was such a wretch that if some woman's husband died and she had anything worth having, he would force her to marry one of his supporters, and he would grab it all. So Magna Carta says not only that a woman is going to get back her inheritance and her marriage portion if her husband dies, but no widow shall be compelled to marry. And when you think about property rights, the right of ownership starts with the right of self-ownership. And Magna Carta says a woman owns herself. She is not the king's to dispose of as he sees fit, through policy or through whim. And Magna Carta also contains a phrase very familiar to our American neighbors, but also a major part of our heritage, and that is no taxation without representation. Scutage and aid aren't the terms we use today, but that's what this part of Magna Carta means, that John cannot raise money in the kingdom without its general consent, except for some very specified things. With John, you had to spell it all out because he was as slippery as he was vicious. And notice the provision, and once to marry our eldest daughter. John would have married his daughter 14 times if he could have made the barons contribute every time. This is extraordinary stuff to find in a document so old that it was written in Latin on a piece of a sheep and sealed in wax. But there are these foundations, the foundations on which Canada was born in freedom. And that is how this nation was born. We are often given this strange, artificial history of Canada in which we have a big government and a helpless and churlish people. And the reason we're wealthy is that the government subsidizes everything from exports to cultural festivals. But that is a preposterous misreading of our history. That is not how we got where we are today. Back when we got the document originally known as the British North America Act, but given this, I think, very bland name, the Constitution Act in 1867, it says in that document that we're given, next slide, a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And you may think that the people who created Confederation had been hitting the champagne a little hard when they were in Charlottetown and in Quebec City. Because if you look at the Constitution that we got in 1867, you could see at once that it's not like the British Constitution in two very important respects. It's all written in one place, and it's a federation. It was one of the pieces of genius in 1867. They wanted Quebec to join Confederation, and Quebec would not join without a guarantee of its right to have its own separate legal system and language, and at that time, religious system. How do you do that in a parliamentary system? How do you stop the majority from taking away the rights of a particular region if they get a majority in the whole country? And the answer is, we can actually be a federation and a parliamentary system. But if that's not like the system of the United Kingdom, what are they talking about? Why is it similar in principle? Because it was a constitution for a free people that protected their liberties. And this was very deliberately drawing upon the British past. There's this idea sometimes you hear that we weren't grown up as a nation until we repatriated our constitution, as though having based ourselves on rights that were 650 years old, surely at that point we're old enough to get the keys to the car, right? You've got to be. 650 years old, you're a grown-up. And the people who made Confederation, Sir John A. Macdonald and his colleagues, were very deliberately creating a free society. That's how they understood themselves. If you look at the debates on Confederation, which were finally published in 1999, it's amazing they were out of print so long. You see people saying, join Confederation, preserve your British liberty. And then someone on the other side of the aisle will say, no, 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 don't join Confederation, preserve your British liberty. Everybody's talking like that in the Parliament of Canada, in the Parliament of Nova Scotia. Everywhere it's being debated. This is what they're talking about. Freedom is how the people who made our Constitution on both sides of the Atlantic understood themselves. I teach American history at the University of Ottawa part-time, and when I teach my courses, I read them this quotation, that the author lives in a land, perhaps the only one in the universe, in which political or civil liberty is the very end and scope of the Constitution. I say, now we're Canada, that's a very American sentiment, right? You can practically see the swagger and the tobacco. But that's a British author. That's William Blackstone in the 1760s writing about England. That is the system that we inherited. And this has enormous implications for how you organize your affairs. If you believe, as Sir John A. Macdonald did, and D'Arcy McGee, and George Brown, and Cartier, and all the people who made Confederation that it was a document for a free people that defended their liberty. And this thread runs right through British history. In 1649, during the English Civil War, the poet John Milton called London the Mansion House of Liberty. Liberty that was not granted by the state, nor respected willingly by the state. Liberty that was defended in court and on the battlefield, time and again. And these sentiments were considered unremarkable at the time. Nobody just about would have argued with them. And it's very peculiar that nowadays you're thought to be from another country or very possibly another planet if you talk about Canada as a free country. But that's how they understood themselves. And when you get the Upper and Lower Canada Rebellion, you get people who are fighting for liberty, including William Lyon Mackenzie, who's meant to be a hero because he stood up to corrupt authorities. But I recently came across a speech given by a judge sentencing some of the most violent of the Upper Canada revolutionaries to be hanged for what they'd done. And this is what he told them. You lived in a country where every man who observes the laws is secure in the protection of life, liberty, and property, which is what the U.S. Declaration of Independence was originally going to say instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, under a form of government which has been the admiration of the world for ages. So this is the supposedly reactionary administration speaking authoritatively from the bench at a very solemn moment and saying this is the system of government. What would anybody want with rebelling against this system? But of course, the reaction of the British authorities to the Upper and Lower Canada revolts was, oops, you know what? We weren't giving them enough liberty. They were right. We really better give them self-government. That the system that they've enjoyed through the ages depends upon popular control of government, and we haven't really given them that. And hence we get the Durham Report, and we get responsible government. Because everybody believes in liberty. And they weren't ashamed of it. There's a marvelous speech. Joseph Howe, who helped bring responsible government to Nova Scotia in the 1840s, he was a newspaper publisher in the 1830s, and he was a real thorn in the side of the colonial administration because he was forever criticizing them for being dishonest, corrupt, incompetent, and arrogant, which they were. And finally, they sued him for libel, and Howe was brought into court, and the judge told the jury, correctly, under British law, truth is not a defense. If what he has said about these people is going to bring them into serious disrepute, then he's guilty of libel, even if every word of it was true. Then Howe stood up, and in a 5-hour speech, they could really talk in those days, Howe challenged the jury. He said to them, "Will you permit the sacred fire of liberty brought by your fathers from the venerable temples of Britain to be quenched and trodden out on the simple altars they have raised?" And the jury said no. They nullified the law, they acquitted Howe, because free people can speak the truth without fear in the face of authority. That's what made Canada the country that it is. And Howe, talking about the sacred fire of liberty, the venerable temples of Britain, you know, you'd be laughed at if you talked that way today. But I don't care. I think this stuff is great. I talk that way because that is what made this country prosperous. That is what made this country culturally dynamic. That is what made this country strong. And in our Magna Carta documentary, we trace all this out and argue, again, that the freedoms that come out of Magna Carta, the respect for individual rights, the placing of the law above the state and the people above the rulers, is the only way to build the kind of society that we have been fortunate enough to inherit. And that's why our project is to reclaim our heritage, get back our birthright, and fix the Constitution. And at this point, if people smile, it's either patronizingly or sourly in many cases. But personally, I am tired of fighting piecemeal battles, of which we win too few anyway. I think that the playing field is badly tilted against us at this point, and if that's the case, what we need to do is level it again. Because it didn't used to be. The playing field used to be level. It used to be a playing field of liberty under law where everyone had an equal chance, and that is how it should be again. And that's why we're asking you to smile, Because I think it's an exciting adventure. Sure, it's a long shot, but settling Canada was a long shot. You know, Samuel Champlain got here and wintered over and discovered that it was unbearably cold in winter, and then in the summer there was these things called mosquitoes. He writes about it in a journal how they annoyed us greatly. Well, I know what he meant, but it didn't stop us, did it? From building a country that is one of the 7 leading economies in the world, that was a pillar of freedom in 2 world wars and in the Cold War. And I think this is just a really exciting prospect. And the job's not going to be easy. And there's a quotation that I use very frequently in talking about this. It's from G.K. Chesterton, who passed away some years ago but just won't shut up. He keeps getting off the great lines. He said, "The only really practical type of rebellion is that which is also a repentance. All real reform springs from the sense of something wrong, not only in our surroundings but in ourselves. There's a lot we can't control in the world, but there are things we can control. And I really think if you're concerned about the direction that the province and the country have been going lately, that there are things we can do better and that we need to do better." And I believe, and I certainly hope Brigitte is with me here because she's speaking after I am, we need to be more strategic in our thinking. We need to put more emphasis on the basics. We need to worry more about the culture in this country and less about the immediate political battles. If we want to convince people and mobilize them on the details, we need to show them this big picture that is exciting and encouraging. And I think we need to put a better face on it. Quite honestly, we need more smiling and less scowling. Scowling, for one thing, scowling doesn't work. It puts people off. And for another thing, we should be smiling because we're happy. Times are tough. We face huge challenges. Isn't this the sort of thing we were put on earth to tackle? Isn't this the kind of thing that really ought to get us excited? Now, I will point out, between Justin Trudeau and Rachel Notley, we're not having the greatest year, perhaps, in the history of traditional liberties. You know, as a philosophy, in partisan terms, things have been bad for a while. But people who want to get back to this traditional idea of Canada are often regarded by their opponents as being angry idiots. And the last thing you want to do when you're engaged in a public discussion is play to the stereotype. Anger is simply counterproductive. You know, so yeah, we had a bad year, we had a bad decade, and we had a bad half century. But you know what? The one before that was kind of grim too. You know, 2 world wars, Great Depression, that wasn't all that great. History's a tough neighborhood. But it always is. That we can't change. What we can change is the attitude we take to it and the way that we try to fix it. There's a speech that I've given a number of times over the years about surviving in a politically correct world. And I quote Peter's first epistle, in which he says, "Be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh of you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness." And back when they wrote the King James Bible, meekness didn't mean mousiness, it meant cheerfulness. If biblical quotations don't do it for you, then there's always Owen Wister's Virginian. Smile when you say that. It really is good advice, because the fact that Canada was born in freedom, that freedom made us great, and only freedom can keep this the kind of country we want it to be, is good news. It's really good news. So we put a smile on our face even when we're doing a documentary on Canadians' right to bear arms, which in fact we are currently doing. Now, we don't have a constitutional right to bear arms right now. Don't go to court with that. But we used to, and we should. We should because it's the kind of people we are and because it's our history. I'm not talking about American history here. Of course, the Americans do have a right to bear arms. One they explicitly preserved when they declared independence as one of the key British liberties they thought was now in danger in the United Kingdom. Because the right to bear arms is in the Bill of Rights, and I don't mean the American Bill of Rights, I mean the British Bill of Rights in 1688. The right of the English to bear arms is enshrined constitutionally by a people who for centuries had distrusted the state and restrained it, and had not been willing to see it go armed when they could not. That William Blackstone, who I quoted earlier, when he talks about Magna Carta, he just matter-of-factly calls it the Great Charter of Liberties, which was obtained sword in hand from King John. Blackstone understood perfectly well that Magna Carta would never have come about had an armed citizenry not been more than a match for a would-be tyrant on the throne of England. The British relied upon armed citizens to maintain law and order. Well into the 19th century, they did not have professional police. And they didn't arm their police, except for extraordinary emergencies, well into the 20th century. They didn't trust the state to be armed and to disarm them. In fact, there's a Royal Navy, of course, and once there are airplanes, there's a Royal Air Force. There's no Royal Army in Britain. Why is there no Royal Army? Because they were not going to see the king with a large body of armed men answerable to him, not to the citizens loose in the mother country. And Sir John A. Macdonald was a firm believer in the right to bear arms. This is one of those things they don't tell you much in school these days. But when people suggested gun control to him, he said, no, that would take away an ancient right of Englishmen. Look at the Bill of Rights. We Canadians have the right to be armed. And if you disarm the law-abiding citizen, you will only leave guns in the hands of the rowdies. And if people look at you strangely if you talk about a Canadian right to self-defense and to the tools necessary for it, they figure you just rappelled in from Lubbock, Texas in camos, chewing tobacco and waving an AK-47. But let me name 3 Canadians who firmly believed in the right to bear arms: Sir John A. Macdonald, William Lyon Mackenzie, and Louis Riel. And if you don't feel some kinship with at least one of those 3, you're not much of a Canadian, are you? I say, Macdonald had read his Blackstone, and Blackstone says, how are the citizens to preserve their essential rights of life, liberty, and property? Well, there's, of course, the powers of Parliament, limitations on the King's prerogative, applying to the courts for redress of injuries, petitioning the King or others, and the right to bear arms. Blackstone's quite clear. In extremis, push to the wall, the fact that you can protect yourself against oppression is the reason you're not going to suffer it. And when William Lyon Mackenzie stages his revolt in Upper Canada, and he's meant to be one of our heroes. Remember the family compact? They had their thugs throw his printing press in Lake Ontario, but he wasn't deterred, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he wrote a constitution. And in his constitution, the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. As for Louis Riel, who was, I'm sorry to say, somewhat of unsound mind, particularly toward the end. But Riel took up arms to defend a people, the Métis, who were being deprived of their rights by the government. He didn't just say it, he did it. And that's important because when you talk about the reasons why we should be allowed to have the weapons necessary for self-defense, and you talk about, in a farming community, obviously you get the need to protect livestock from predators. We also talk about the need to protect yourself, especially in an area where the police are far away. If you have a dangerous intruder, you can't wait for the authorities to show up, and you shouldn't have to wait. But if you talk about political oppression, people say, oh, I don't know, that's not very Canadian. Well, it is if you look at what brought King John to Runnymede. If you look at the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I. You look at the Glorious Revolution, in which the English Bill of Rights is created. You look at the Upper and Lower Canada rebellions. And also, on one of the more sordid parts of our history, but you have to take it warts and all, the first people just about to be targeted systematically by the government trying to take away their arms, and if they couldn't get their guns, they'd at least take their ammunition, was Aboriginals. And the government certainly did not intend to respect their other rights when it said, you know what, we better make sure they can't fight back. And their heritage, too, is certainly one of bearing arms. I would love to tell the people who crossed the Bering Strait, braved Canadian winters with nothing but stone tools and animal skins. You, sir, may not be trusted with a spear. You're going to hurt yourself, or you're going to engage in a wanton attack on someone else. You better hand it over. You'd be lucky if you got the butt end of the spear in response to that speech. All of this is part of a heritage of people who were free, who were independent, who were self-reliant. Isn't that who we are? Isn't that a description of Canadians? Aren't we the true North, strong and free? And that may not be the case at the moment with our institutions, and it may not be the case at the moment with our laws, but it is our heritage, and it's our identity. It is how we understand ourselves, and we're right to do it. And that's why, our next slide, we are determined to fix the Constitution. That's our third project. Say, we were going to hold off on this, but we found a funding partner, so we went with it. Because the fundamental rules under which we live are not working properly. They don't respect the labor and effort and earnings of the law-abiding, honest citizen. They don't respect our right to defend ourselves, and they don't respect our right to govern ourselves. Our present Constitution, it's a real dog's breakfast. It's a mess in all kinds of ways. There are all kinds of things we'd like to change. I'm sure you can think of a bunch, including almost certainly we'd like to fix the Senate. But we can't. You know why we can't? Because the amending formula doesn't work. The government can do virtually anything it likes. Apparently, under Justin Trudeau, first past the post voting is going to go the way of the pipeline. They can do almost anything they want. He expelled all the Liberal senators from his caucus. It looks like he can just get rid of the Senate if he feels like it, or so he seems to think, because he's planning to govern without having any way to get bills through the upper house. But we can't do anything. Our Constitution excludes the people, and that's really weird. And we're kind of used to it by now, but it's weird, and it's un-Canadian. You see, for many centuries in England, Magna Carta and the common law stood above the Parliament. Statutes that contradicted Magna Carta were null and void. This was expressly enacted again and again as early as the 14th century. And a great jurist and political leader in the fight for liberty, Edward Coke, who was instrumental in rallying Parliament against the tyranny of James I and then Charles I, at a critical debate in the British Parliament over reaffirming the rights of Englishmen. The House of Lords was wavering. They thought maybe we should give the king some power to rule by decree. And Coke stood up and he reminded his parliamentary fellows and he warned the king, Magna Carta is such a fellow as he will have no sovereign. That is to say that Magna Carta in England at that time stood in the position that the American Constitution does to this day. It came from the people, it stood above the government, and no act of government that was contrary to Magna Carta could be valid, even if it was passed by a vote of the Parliament. Unfortunately, over time in the United Kingdom, something went subtly but very pervasively wrong. Parliament gradually became supreme. It came to be the case that Parliament could do anything. The next slide. A variety of things went wrong. The executive branch, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, or the Premier in the Cabinet, gradually came to dominate the legislature. This is the danger, by the way, that triggered the American Revolution. After seeing kings executed or exiled for trying to just crush Parliament, George III had a different idea. I'll seduce it. Through perks, through flattery, through outright bribery if I need to, I will leave MPs in place and let the people elect them, but I will corrupt them so that they become appendages of the crown. And when the Americans revolted and said the king has become too strong, he is taking away our liberties, a lot of people in Britain went, you know what, they're right. In 1780, at the height of the fighting over the American Revolution, this motion passed the British House of Commons. The influence of the crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. And it was. Coming out of that period, Parliament dominates British politics and British government. You get the Victorian golden age of parliamentary government, where ministries regularly fall because they lose votes in the Commons. MPs are independent, and government is tiny. In Victorian Britain, the government takes about 10% of GDP. It does not take away citizens' property. It does not interfere with the British right to bear arms. If you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, Holmes says, Watson, this could be dangerous. Do you have your revolver? And does Watson ever say, oh, no, I don't have a permit? Good heavens, a gun, I wouldn't think of it. Does he fill out a form explaining who he's sleeping with? Of course not. He slips it in his pocket, and they go off and they get the bad guys. But Parliament, it's tied so closely to the people. It provides such good limited government. There isn't even compulsory schooling in Britain until 1870, and yet they launched the Industrial Revolution, rule the waves, and are the cultural envy of the world. That people think it's under control. The cabinet has to come from the House of Commons. The House of Commons comes from the people. Our rights can never again be threatened. The Americans didn't see it that way. That's why they created this written constitution, looking back to Magna Carta. But the British thought it's fine. Nothing bad can happen. And gradually, Parliament became supreme. As Albert Dicey put it, by around 1900, if a legislature decided that all blue-eyed babies should be murdered, the preservation of blue-eyed babies would be illegal. He says legislators must go mad before they could pass such a law, and subjects be idiotic before they could submit to it. But there was no such thing in Britain at that point as an unconstitutional law. Anything Parliament chose to do would take legal effect. In fact, as an earlier commentator put it, Jean-Louis Delhomme, who wrote a brilliant book on the English Constitution in the 18th century, it is a fundamental principle with English lawyers that Parliament can do everything but make a woman a man or a man a woman. Well, obviously now it can do that too, right? And as Parliament acquired all this power, it occurred to ambitious people that if they wanted supreme power, what they had to do was control Parliament, tear it away from its roots in the people, become its master, and they were the master of the kingdom. And this is what happened. Gradually but inexorably, prime ministers and cabinets and party machines developed a control over the legislature, what George III had tried to do and failed to do, where Parliament is left in place, but it no longer represents you, it represents them. This process, especially as the franchise is extended, the party machinery organizes campaigns, chooses candidates, and when you send an MP to Ottawa to represent you, you find that 2 or 3 months later, they're representing Ottawa to you, not the other way around. And I had a couple of charts drawn up when I was at Sun News Network to illustrate the nature of this problem. This is Canada in 2014 with the Harper majority. And as you see, it's a seating plan of the Parliament, and there you have the blue Tories and the orange NDP and the red Liberals and the Greens and a couple of independents, and believe it or not, Bloc MPs. There actually are still Bloc MPs. It's like seeing a stegosaurus thinking, don't you know the Jurassic ended? But there they are. But the white ones, the blue ones with the white squares, are members of the Tory caucus who are either full cabinet ministers, that's the first tier, or else have secondary jobs like parliamentary secretary, chief whip, and so on. All of them are essentially members of the executive branch, and half of the rest hope to be. They're not interested in controlling the executive. They're interested in getting control of the executive, becoming the executive. Here's an even worse one. This is before the last Ontario election. The Liberals are in a minority under Kathleen Wynne. Look at the Red Caucus. All but 2 of them are actually members of the executive branch, and they get extra money, tens of thousands of dollars, plus flattery, provided they act as agents of the central government machinery, not of the voters who sent them to Parliament. Now, this happened for a variety of reasons. Government agendas got bigger, and governments had to be more unified and more powerful to carry out all the things they wanted to do. We ran through a series of crises that made us think that we needed bigger government. Again, Blackstone says that legislation really only does 2 things. It either says what the common law is or fixes some small problem in the common law. It's not meant to remake the conditions under which we live. But you'd be astonished if a political party were to go into an election and not promise to transform your life today. And they need a big government. And so, as I say, we went through this crisis, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, creating this big state. Then the welfare state and the crisis of the 1960s, we forgot about our traditional liberty, and we started believing that all state action was good unless you could prove it was bad. The exact opposite of what we believed going back through Magna Carta, really through Magna Carta into Anglo-Saxon England. And we got, the war on poverty, the Great Society, the Just Society, who knows what all. Endless expansive projects. If only the state had more power, if only it could tear free of the restraints, and by now it pretty much has. And a lot of people like this. I collect these photos as I go around of social change. Your turn to change the world. I am a rebel, some kid at a prep school. Does he look like a rebel? But everybody's a rebel today. And tomorrow will be nothing like today. That's how the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank tries to sell itself to you in airports. Well, if tomorrow's going to be nothing like today, I have no idea what I should do. But I don't like the sound of that. I don't like the sound of 7 billion people all frantically changing things 3 times a day, barely stopping to eat. Because it means turmoil and chaos. It means forgetting where we came from and forgetting what worked. And this is what I'm talking about when we talk about getting our country back, is getting back to a situation where if we want to change something, we do it as individuals. We think of an invention. We decide to move. We decide to start a charity. All the kinds of things that built this country, instead of thinking that the state has to do all this to us, instead of for us. Because we are living in a weird period right now. Dicey points out, and I think it's a very important fact, in all of English history, periods of a lot of legislative activity are actually rare. They're the anomalies. The era of Edward I, the age of the Tudors, the period of the Restoration in the 17th century, and then the period from the mid-19th century to when he was writing, which is the late 19th century. But that one's never stopped. We have had constant change and turmoil and legislative hyperactivity for almost 200 years now. I mean, change is old hat. Change is stale. Change is reactionary. But can't I at some point say, are we there yet? If this is all so great, at what point do we actually arrive? Where is this brave new world you've been promising us? And then instead of fixing any of this stuff, we got this unidentified constitutional object in 1982 that combined the American system where judges can overrule legislatures with the idea that the people are not sovereign and just took the whole thing right out of our hands. And this is no way to do anything. If I can quote Edward Cook again, out of the old fields must come the new corn. He knew in the 17th century, if we want to do anything that is of lasting value, it has to be done based on the principles that got us where we are today. And that's why we're drafting this new Constitution. It has a series of fairly simple, basic ideas. Put the legislature back in charge, not the executive. I don't want politicians backed by senior bureaucrats churning out thousands of pages of regulations that you can't read or stop. I don't want 800-page omnibus bills rammed through legislatures that haven't read them. I don't want budgets that don't go through parliamentary committees because we elect the legislators. We don't elect the executive branch. We also want to fix the federation. Central Canada has too big a role. I don't have to argue this point much to people in Alberta. But there are ways of fixing this, including one of our more radical notions, but I think the time has come, splitting up the central Canadian provinces. Why should the people of Temiskaming be in the same province as the people who live on Yonge Street in Toronto? It just doesn't make sense. A Bill of Rights that says the state shall make no law infringing freedom of speech or freedom of worship. The state shall not take property except through due process for public use with just and timely compensation. The state shall not, over and over again, and no weaselly clause saying these rights are guaranteed only to the extent that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. In a free and democratic society, the state can't take away your rights. There will be no bolt holes in our Bill of Rights. There will be no provisions for a free lunch. We're going to get rid of equalization. You know, I sometimes think maybe people in Alberta think they're finally going to see a dime of that money instead of just paying it all the time. But you know it's a bad program. You know how much harm it's done to Alberta. You know how much harm it's done to the recipients by paying them to have bad policies. Well, there will be no more of that. And most importantly, it's going to put the people back in charge the way they were under Magna Carta, the way they were under the common law. The British North America Act was enacted by legislatures, but it was put to the people because in virtually every colony, they had an election on the issue of confederation. And the voters knew if you elect this party, you're getting Confederation, and it will look like this. Here's the draft document. They understood what they were voting for, and the politicians all agreed we must consult the people. But the '82 Constitution, hoo-ha. Nobody who voted for Trudeau in 1980 thought they were getting that. Remember, he was made Prime Minister with 74 out of 75 Quebec seats, but Quebec has never signed the Constitution. It didn't have a popular mandate in the province that gave him his electoral mandate. And if you look at the amending formula, you see where the problem is. This is the amending formula to the American Constitution. That's the whole thing. Congress passes measures by 2/3 of each house. They go to the states, 3/4 ratify, the Constitution is amended. Clear, simple, an appeal to the people. And the result of that, when they decided they wanted directly to elect their senators, which happened early in the 20th century, before that the states chose them, this is what happens. The 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution, that's the whole thing. And they've had elected senators ever since. Now here's our amending formula. It's over 1,000 words. You can't read it, but it wouldn't help if you could. Nobody knows what it says. The Supreme Court doesn't even know what it says. But what it doesn't say is we the people. Nowhere in there is our ability to affect the fundamental rules, and this is the result. Cheers indeed. Now, I understand that fixing the Constitution is an ambitious project. It's tilting at windmills, but why would they give me a lance if I'm not meant to tilt at windmills? Do you remember Margaret Thatcher? People laughed at Margaret Thatcher. 6 days before she was elected Prime Minister, she told a TV interviewer, "I can't bear Britain in decline. I just can't. We who either defeated or rescued half of Europe, and look at us now." And she got a majority, and she made a lot of changes. And I can't bear to see Canada tear loose from its roots and go into decline. The economy is stagnant, people frustrated, government out of touch. This is no way for us to conduct our affairs, and there's no reason why we should have to, especially because the state is in crisis all around you. You can see this every day when you pick up the newspapers. It's not working. Politicians make these amazing promises during campaigns, but they can't keep them, even when they try, which surprisingly often they don't. And they can't afford not to keep them. There is red ink from coast to coast in this country. Government liabilities, off book, on book, they are big, they are growing, they are ominous. It's a problem. So why am I smiling? Well, I'm with Theodore Roosevelt. Far and away, the best prize that life offers is the chance to work hard at work worth doing. And we have work worth doing here. And our Constitution project is asking you to join in a very important task of getting Canada back on the foundations of Magna Carta, where it belongs, the only place where it can work. If I can quote George Washington, one more quotation. At his opening remarks in 1787 at Philadelphia, he said, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair." Could you ask for a better task in public life than that? I can't think of one. I think it's exactly what we need to do now, and I'm excited about doing it. If you want to hear more about this, learn more about the story of Canada and our projects, you can visit my website. It's johnrobson.ca. You can buy the various things. We're also going to have them on display in the break. And you can join us in this project of getting the country back where it belongs. Because this story that people are told, skip the next slide and go on to one, this false story of a people dependent on government reminds me of this line, next one, from Prince Caspian, the second of C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, about under the tyrant usurper Miraz. The sort of history that was taught in Narnia under Miraz's rule was duller than the truest history you ever read, and less true than the most exciting adventure story. And I find that about this tale of Canadians needing the state. It's boring. Who wants to be told that? What young person will be inspired by that? And it's completely untrue. This is a country that was built on freedom. Our foundations are in Magna Carta, in the rights of Englishmen, in the rights of Canadians, in that Constitution similar in principle. A small government and a big people. That's who we are. We were born free, and to the extent that we become less free, we become less Canadian. And none of us, I think, wants to see that happen. So, we are the true North, strong and free. That is who we've always been. It's who we should always be. That is our heritage, and that is our identity, and that is the adventure that I hope you will join me in engaging in. As to how we're going to do it, well, after the break, Brigitte will take over and talk to you about how we get this story back. Because if we don't change the culture, we can't change the politics. But the culture, the roots are strong. Magna Carta is still there underlying it all. This is Canada, and we should take it back with a smile.
The other part of this team is Brigitte Pellerin, and she's a documentary filmmaker with over 15 years experience in Canada's media environment. She lives in Ottawa, obviously, and during the summer she spends time on a small island on Lake Ontario. She's also, she calls herself a homeschooling mama, and she's also a martial artist, so lots of talents. So please let me help me welcome Brigitte Pellerin.
Thank you to John for setting this up. Unlike my husband, I promise not to use any of these slides because I find this distracting. Also promise not to use long words, because. And I will also not talk too much about history, although every now and then I'll glance at him and say, I'm not messing this one up, right, honey? This was really that king who was a wretched one. But he's the historian, and I'm more of the communications person in the team. And together, I think we make some decent movies that I hope some of you will watch. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is what I believe it was George W. Bush said that, but I'm pretty sure he did not invent this. He said at some point, what happens in your house matters more than what happens in the White House. Now, no matter who invented this expression, they were very right. And I'm here to talk to you about that side of the equation and why, when we talk about reclaiming our history, reclaiming our heritage, taking back our country, if you will, from the people who seem to don't know we have a cool history with really good heroes and the tradition of liberty. Either they don't know about it, or worse, they know about it, but they're trying to stamp it out. I said we need to fight back. And we fight back, well, some of us fight back in politics. I know some of you are more interested in that side of things, and that's fine. We need good people in politics. We don't have nearly enough. Others, like us, would rather focus on the culture and the family, and that's really my side of things. I'm the mom, and this is what I do. When we say taking back the culture, culture matters more than politics. We're not the only ones saying this. Mark Stein, a lot of you I'm sure are fans of his. He's also very big on this. Culture trumps politics. When you have the right kind of culture, you wind up with the right kind of politics. It happens almost naturally. If you're trying to change the culture through the politics, very often you hit a wall because people are not listening to you. I said at a conference this weekend in Edmonton, if you're trying to take back the legislature, right, here you have a government that a lot of people here don't necessarily like. Same thing in Ottawa at the federal level. It doesn't matter if you're a political party with huge amounts of money and slick ads and everything. If nobody's listening to you, you're not going to go anywhere. What you have to do is make sure people listen to you. Okay, how do we do that? Well, there are several ways. And so I have a few streams in my head on how to get to that, and I'm going to try and merge them all at some point into one coherent narrative. But I say we start in the home. Those of us with children or grandchildren need to take them under our wing and tell them what their history is all about. And this is one reason why we make those documentaries, because they focus on these heroes of liberty. And Edward Cook, Stephen Langton, Simon de Montfort, all these people who fought and died for our liberty. We need to know their story because it's part of our story. And we put those stories out in a film format to make it easier sometimes for people to absorb. We also put them in the book format so you can read about it and then tell your children about it in any way you think is appropriate for your children. But it needs to start with your children or grandchildren. And when I say start with them, you can't just lecture at them. If you've ever tried that with your teenager, chances are, you know what, honey, I need to tell you what's right, and very often they'll just roll their eyes all the way to their shoulder blades and won't listen to you. You need to start earlier than that. You need to start with a proper relationship with your children. I know that sounds silly saying that, right? But it's not. You need to make sure that your children are listening to you in a way that they listen to you as much as they listen to their friends. How about that? They care what you think as much as they care what their friends think. That's the kind of relationship you need to have with your children in order for you to be able to communicate with them effectively about other things, things other than their curfew and no, you can't have the car this weekend. You need to be able to have those kinds of conversations. And I have never found a better way to achieve that kind of relationship with children, and not just my own. I also teach karate to small children, and I try to build relationships with them as well. I've never found a better way to do that than to really engage with them, to spend time with them. A famous politician, he's a European member of the European Parliament, but he's an Englishman. His name is Daniel Hannan. Maybe some of you know about him. He once told me, as an aside, that children spell love T-I-M-E, that there's no such thing as quality time. There's only time for children. And so when I find that when you engage and spend time to be with your children or grandchildren, you develop that relationship. So that's step number one, because if you don't have that, there's no point talking to them. You're talking to a wall. But once you have that, what else do you have to do to get your children to be the kind of people who will turn out to be the voters that you need to change the political culture? Well, there's a couple of things, but one that I spend a lot of time on, especially in my homeschooling at home and in the children that I teach at the dojo, is to worry about not just what they learn as far as academics goes, right? Because we all know that you all want your children to be good in English, math, and science, geometry, etc., etc. But you also have to worry about their moral education. You also have to make sure your children are strong mentally, they have strong discipline, they're resilient, they're tough mentally, that they're generous, that they're loving, and they're courageous. Because if you don't have courage, it doesn't matter what other virtues you have, you won't be able to stand up for them. And you want to worry about that and expect a lot of your children. I like to say, one of my rhetorical shortcuts, that tough love is real love. And that if you don't expect a lot of your children, they will not rise to the occasion. As I say, I'm martial artist, I teach karate, but my teachers, they're two Greek brothers. And they're not just from Greece, they're from Sparta. They've traced their history and they go all the way back to Sparta, and that explains a lot when you think about it. They're extraordinarily tough. They're former world champions, people who just are so disciplined and so hardworking that they're just amazing just to look at. And they train us very, very hard, as you can imagine. But they don't just have the tough, they have the love as well. They take a very keen interest in their students. They've been at it for over 30 years now, and they have the children of the first kids that they started teaching coming to them for training. They really love their students. There is a lot of love, and they're tough. And as a result of that, the children that they train, and they teach, including my own, who are being trained by them, grow to be better people, better leaders, morally strong people. And not everybody agrees with everyone else on the politics, but you have real, complete human beings right there, with the right kind of academics, the right kind of discipline, and the right kind of moral education. So that, to me, would be kind of second step, right? First, you have a relationship with your children, and then you make sure that they have their overall education, that they have everything about them that's right. Now we can talk. Now we can talk about stories. And some of you may not have children, by the way, just as an aside. That doesn't matter. You interact with some sometimes, right? Maybe you have nieces, nephews, or just people you encounter sometimes. Take the time to talk to them. People say, "Oh, those millennials, we don't know these people. They're always on their phones and they talk with their thumbs, and I don't know who they are, and they're entitled, and they're little brats, and they don't know anything about discipline and hard work." Maybe, but it may just also be that it's a facade. It may also be that if you took the time to talk to them, you'd find that in a lot of cases, they think a lot like you. And they would like to hear somebody tell them what their true history is. So tell them about their history. Now, how do you do that? Well, you have to tell them stories, right? Because you can't just start with, well, in 1867, there were these things, and everybody's falling asleep. History in high school was supremely dull, in my experience. Every time I say this, other people say, "Yeah, me too, yeah, pretty much." And why was it dull? Because people did not talk to you in your history classes with their hearts or your emotions. It did not address your emotions. It was just trying to stuff dates into your head like you were some kind of computer. Don't do that. Tell them the stories of the people who made this country, who made this culture great. We were, yesterday morning in Edmonton, we were talking about gun control. And a lot of us at the table were in agreement that, the left and the anti-gun people, they're very good at getting people to freak out about guns, right? And you know why they're good at it? Because guns can be scary, especially to people who don't handle them very often, right? The idea, if you're a human being, the idea that some evil person could just randomly burst into your child's school and start shooting, it's a scary thing, obviously. Now, it doesn't happen a lot, but we all know, we all have that in our gut. It gets to us, right? What if this were to happen to my child? And our answer, and I'm not just blaming other people, I've done that too. Our answer when people start talking about how guns can be dangerous, which is true, right? They can be dangerous. They're very dangerous tools, is to say, oh yes, but look at the statistics, and look at this, and look at that. And we're talking with our heads. We're answering an raw emotional reaction. My child in a pool of blood with numbers. You know why they're winning that debate? Because they are addressing emotions and we're addressing people's brains. Now, I'm not saying you should stop thinking, that's not true, but when you're telling stories about your country, about your culture, talk with your heart as well as your head. Never forget the heart. And too often, people on the political right, we tend to go for the head, and just about only the head. We really need to talk with our hearts and with our blood and with our guts, and let it show. Don't be dull, right? That's another thing. Very often you will start something, and then the kid will be interested for a couple of minutes, and then you see them start the flag. That's okay. We can stop there and start again some other time. Right? Don't force it. Don't make them want to flee you. And then make sure that they understand that when you're talking to them about your history and what matters to you, you're doing that because you care about them. Make sure that they feel that. You'd be amazed when you start doing that with children. And it sounds corny, right? It is corny, but corny works. When you start doing that to children, just sometimes, after a little while, their eyes will suddenly, they will want to hear more about it. Maybe they will even tell you this. Can you tell me another story, Grandpa? Tell me again about Stephen Langton. Sure, son. Sit down. We'll talk about it again. Right? This works. I know it works because I have done it, including with children and young children and teenagers, including some that were not my own. I don't have teenagers yet. But we've done that by going to high school and talking to them about their history, and their eyes are like this, and they all say this. Nobody told me about that. Nobody told me about that part of my history. Where was this in my courses? Right? They are hungry for a story. Everybody, every human being hungers for stories. Let's fill that hunger. Right? And as you move up towards that, then you eventually develop a generation of children, young people, young adults, who have better relationships with their elders. They're more respectful by having a better relationship with them, have a better education that's an overall education, and that know their history, and that know their stories. What do you think happens to these people when they start to vote? Do you think that they will vote for the people promising them free lunch that they know cannot exist? Probably not. I'm hoping not. That's my bet anyway. But every single time you start talking about people and you get to that stage where they start to see it, then the light goes on. And my goal in all of this, in all of these projects, and why I'm working with my husband to make all these stories, and why we're here talking to people instead of being in front of a movie somewhere with a glass of wine, why we do the things we do, is because we believe that if we do change the culture, starting with each individual human being, and I focus especially on children, being a mom, I'm kind of obsessed with that. If you've had young children in your life, you'll know what I mean. If you talk to human beings at an individual level, that is, one by one, how you change the culture. This is how they've managed to abolish slavery, by convincing each and every person that it was wrong, up to a point where there were a critical mass of people who wanted to have it abolished. Then you had the Civil War, and then it was abolished. This is the way I hope one day we can abolish abortion on demand in this country, by focusing on stories one after the other and talking to people at an emotional level, talking to them about that. at a, telling stories about it. And I want, in a larger sense, in reclaiming Canada's institutions, reclaiming our history and saying, this country is great. I don't believe your stories about the welfare state. I want everyone to know and everyone to believe that their country is great. And the way to do that is to change the culture one person at a time with, if I could get 100 people at a time, that would be even better, more efficient, but one person at a time with stories. And I believe that that is the best way to regain our culture and regain our institutions. And I hope that you'll join us in this adventure. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte. We've got some time for questions of either John or Brigitte. I can't see John, but I'm sure he's here somewhere. Does anybody have any questions? Maybe we could get the mic working. If anybody has a question, they could come to the mic. Or do we have any questions? Maybe you're all spellbound. While you're trying to think of a question, let me just... Sure, come on up, Kevin. Yeah, we got a mic working. Come on up, Kevin. Mic's right. Mike, was that mic
Does this one
working?
work too?
Yep. Okay.
I guess first off, thank you both for coming. My wife and I also homeschool, so way to go. That's great. I think it's no better. I'm actually a teacher. I teach on a reserve, but we homeschool our own kids. Probably this is more directed for you, John, and we were talking about this a little bit, but how do we go about making change when you look at a person like Stephen Harper, until he got elected, there were so many things that he said and did that wanted to make changes. Reform the Senate was a big one. And then once he got into power, it seemed like the system was too big for him to change, or he just didn't have the principles anymore to make all of those things happen. What would you suggest is the best way to go about, really going about making these changes and actually having them come to fruition?
Well, something Ralph Klein once said, show me a big enough parade and I will get in front of it. I think that the way to get political change is to create constituencies for it. And I know that with Stephen Harper, there was this kind of cunning calculation that there aren't a lot of conservatives out there, so we have to do it by stealth. And I wrote indignantly about this in the National Post, this amounted to governing with a paper bag over your head. And I really thought they'd have done better if they'd been more forthright about what they believed. But there need to be more of us, because one of the things about the history of liberty from Magna Carta on is that when people stood up and said, this is wrong, we need to protect our freedom, their country stood with them. Brigitte was talking about Stephen Langton. The actual story of Stephen Langton, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And when he was first appointed, Bad King John didn't want him in England. And so John and the Pope had a big fight over this. Finally, Langton was allowed into England. He forgave John his misdeeds, provided that he respected the liberties of the English, which John, of course, had no intention of doing and didn't. And so Langton convened a bunch of leading clerics and some barons at Westminster Abbey in 1213, and he read out the coronation oath of John's great-grandfather, Henry I, saying he would respect the traditional liberties of the English. And he said to the group, we've got to get this no-good weasel John to reissue this thing and add to it. We have got to add the following things, and that's the basis of Magna Carta, because a bunch of people stood up and said yes. Not just mucky-mucks, not just archbishops with pointed hats and barons and with fancy titles and French names, but knights, ordinary people, stood up and said, yes, these are our liberties. And when Stephen Harper started breaking his promises and running big deficits and handing out money to everybody with a hat to extend, I used to get dozens of these press releases every week. There wasn't a sufficient outcry saying, no, we sent you there to shrink government, and we will back you if you shrink it, and we will turn on you if you don't. And the result of our not doing that, of course, is that we got Justin Trudeau. So we got the worst of both worlds. What could have been worse than making government bigger in order to have the Liberals win? He should have tried it, but there weren't enough of us standing up and saying, I mean, in Alberta there probably were. But that's why we need to go this route of telling the stories. And I'll tell you another story, if I may. Canute. Do you all know about King Canute, the guy who thought he could stop the tide? Har, har, har. One of the few stories that has survived, but it's a mangled story. The real story of Canute, and he's an 11th century Danish king of England, was that his courtiers were telling him, oh, you are so wonderful, you are the beloved of God, you are such a mighty king, you could even command the oceans. And Canute said, gee, that's an interesting theory. Let's go give that the old empirical test. You carry my chair down at low tide, and I'll sit in it, and we'll try this. So he sat in his chair, the water started advancing. Canute said, halt, I command you, I am Canute. Of course, sea poured into his boots. And then he turned to his courtiers and he said, you idiots, I'm the king. I get flattery morning, noon, and night. I don't even have to pay for it. You have to tell me what I'm doing wrong. You have to tell me what I can't do. You have to tell me when I'm being an idiot. How else can I be the monarch that these people deserve? And that story was told at firesides and tables in the English-speaking world for nearly 1,000 years before it got forgotten. And that's why the English reacted badly. And by the English, I mean in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, when a ruler was arrogant, they remembered the story of Canute and said, this is no Canute. And we need to have people who believe that this is their heritage. And that's why, as Brigitte says, you can't do this by hectoring people, but you can do it with engaging stories. And we also tell the story in the Magna Carta documentary of Alfred and the Cakes, so you should get the documentary and find out what that was about. Because it's another story that was told for 1,000 years about how the English-speaking people expected to be ruled. And nowadays, if we get cynical and expect to be ruled badly, we will be ruled badly. But if we believe, even when Edward Coke, who in the part of his tumultuous career was thrown in the Tower of London by James I, he'd been a Speaker of the House of Commons, Attorney General, head of both the civil and criminal courts, and then he was a political prisoner. But James never dared to kill him, and he never dared to burn his papers, because so many Englishmen were upset that Coke was in prison, and they would have done something if Coke had been murdered. And that we need to look at one another and say, yes, we are all in this together, and yes, we have one another's backs. And we've got to build that kind of society so that when we send someone to Edmonton or to Ottawa, they know they better do what they said, because enough of us are going to care if they don't. And that's what we build with these stories.
Every single time that liberty was threatened in our history, here in Canadian, British, or even American history, it was defended by people who knew their history. You know, when I say, tell the stories to your children, people say, oh, that's cute, lady, but I need something more practical than this. No, that is the practical step everyone can take and everyone should take, so that everybody knows their history, so that we go back to being the kind of people who backed George Washington. Would you have wanted to be on George Washington's side? Yes or no? Yes, of course. These people knew their history. We have to be like that. And there's only one way to do it, is to know our history and to teach it to our own children and anyone else who will listen.
And just one other thing to add to that, like I said, I teach on a reserve, and storytelling is a huge part of the culture for the Cree and probably most First Nations groups. And I mean, I never forget that it was the first event I ever went to. I grew up in Ontario, and Mike Harris was the premier then, and one of the MLAs out there said to me, you know, Kevin, one of the things that separates us between the NDP, he said, most of the people that come to you with a funding request, 95% of them are good. He says they're not stupid ideas, they're actually pretty good ideas, most of them. He said, but what separates us from the NDP, and Bob Ray was in before them, is he said sometimes you have to say no to a good idea because you can't afford it. And unfortunately, the NDP always said yes, even though they couldn't. And I think that's probably what we have now. Thank you very much, Bob.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, but I'm not trying to cut you off, but if you have another question too, but I just wanted to add to what...
I didn't see a line behind me, that's why I stayed over here.
Okay, good. I just wanted to add to what John said about Canute's advisors, because, to me, a lot of us really good conservative supporters were just like Canute's advisors. I've always said the conservatives only talk to their friends, and you could only be their friend if you told them what they wanted to hear. And some of us were trying to take this message to Stephen Harper and company, and they would say, no, we don't have to talk to you to know whether we're right or not. We just have to check the mail. We can tell whether we're right or not, whether the money is rolling in. And in a year when they ran the biggest deficit in Canadian history, they raised as much money as the Conservative Party had ever raised. That's not their fault that they raised it. It's our fault that we said it without paying attention to what they were doing. And so I think, the problems that we're in, both federally and provincially, is as much to do with a lack of responsibility and a lack of us paying attention as anything. I don't think we can blame our leaders. I think we have an obligation, as John and Brigitte are pointing out, we have an obligation to hold our leaders to account, and we have failed miserably.
And I'll tell another story from the documentary we filmed at Rochester Castle. Is after Magna Carta was sealed, John immediately broke his word, and he gathered an army, and he was trying to get from southeast England to London. And to get across the Medway River, he was blocked by Rochester Castle, which had been placed by Stephen Langton in the hands. Oh, and Langton's also the guy who divided the Bible into chapters, by the way. He was quite a busy chap. So Langton had staffed the castle with men loyal to the cause of liberty. And John besieged Rochester Castle, and these things are almost impossible to take frontally. So what they did was they tunneled under the foundations of the castle, and they propped it up with timber so it wouldn't come down on their heads. And then John wrote to his justiciar and said, "Get me 40 fat pigs of the kind least good for eating," rendered them, greased up the timber, set them on fire, and half of the castle came tumbling down. But the defenders held out in half of the keep for another 5 days, and there's a great movie, Ironclad, about that. Finally, hunger drove them out, and John had erected a memorial to the pigs and a gallows where he planned to hang them all. But then somebody pointed out to him that the fortunes of war being as they were, he might one day be captured and regret the precedent, so he just hanged one guy. But you think about the men who fought at Rochester Castle and the women who told them, "Go and do it. I know how vengeful that king is." John liked to starve people to death, so if your husband was up there with a bow and that siege succeeded, you were in grave danger. But a lot of these women said, "Don't you dare come home and tell me you surrendered the castle." And so these people dared, in the face of John's evil, to stand up for what they believed in. And this is an inspiring story. Again, you want to get young people interested in the cause. They walk in the footsteps of heroes, of people who've snatched victory from the jaws of defeat time and again against appalling odds, whether it's against foreign tyranny or against the domestic kind. And they've done it because when danger threatened, they rallied together and said, "I know what kind of people we are." And that's how we do it, by being the kind of people who do rally, who don't let our member of parliament be bullied for going against the party leadership and driven out, who don't let politicians weasel out, because we're not going to be hanged by King John if we lose. Whatever happens to us isn't going to be that bad. So if we stand up, maybe we'll find other people are standing with us, because somebody's got to be first, and why not you? Right? Life is short. Let's do something with it that is worthy of the opportunity that we're given. And throughout 1,000 years, when people have done that, others have stood up with them. And if it has happened for 1,000 years, I believe it can happen for another 1,000 years. I don't think it's hopeless at all. It's dark, it's grim, but it's bracing. And I think we need to just keep building these connections. One thing that came out of this conference that Danny organized that we were at, one of the speakers said, something like 5.9 million people voted for the federal Conservatives in 2015. But those people gave only $15 million to conservative organizations, not political parties, but the organizations that are trying to spread the message and dig up the details and promote the cause of freedom. He said that's $2.70 per year per voter. And I think that we need, I agree with Danny, less money to political parties and more money to groups like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Danny's Economic Education Association. Obviously, I have a dog in this fight. We are very much hoping that you will help us with our documentary projects. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms that fights. There was in Toronto, they told a Christian group they could not speak in a public square. Anybody else could speak, but they told these Christians, you can't come here because that's advocacy. And John Carpe and his colleagues sent a letter to the city saying, we are lawyers and we think this is wrong, and the city gave in. There are all kinds of groups out there, but we need to build up this conservative infrastructure to spread the message, to share the stories, to create a strong civil society or recreate one, so that the politicians, because politicians will not, in 99 times out of 100, they will not lead. They will get in front of the parade and follow it from there. We need to create that parade. We need to strengthen all of those people who are working to promote liberty and tell the stories, and the stories of these heroes, the improbable stories. I mean, if World War II had not happened and someone wrote this great epic and sent it to a publisher, oh, I've got this great story, the publisher would have sent it back, said, this is too over the top, you got to be kidding me. This Hitler's too wacky, you got to make him more likable, no one's that evil. Winston Churchill, no, you got to tone him down. This escape at Dunkirk, no, that can't have happened. The Battle of Midway, all of this is too ridiculous. But it happened, it really happened. And that is amazing. And the courage of the people who fought in the Battle of Britain, who were exhausted and knew the Luftwaffe was too strong, but the British, the Canadians, the Poles, the French, the Poles who smuggled the Enigma machine out so that the British could read the German codes and evade the U-boats in that critical period in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Canadian merchant sailors, 1 in 8 of them didn't come back, who kept going out in unseaworthy ships with insufficient escort. The torpedo biplanes that crippled the Bismarck. These stories need to be told. We need to build the infrastructure that tells those stories, and don't give money to politicians who are playing you, because too many of them are. You've had that happen here too often. The people who are going to build the movement are the ones I really, and I know, yes, I have a self-interest in this, but I'm doing it because I think it's right. That's how we do it, is to build up the civil society that creates the parade the politicians follow.
Drew, did you have a question? Go ahead.
I'd just like to say, once again, thank you very much for coming. Very insightful and very inspiring. I just want to get your take on what's happening in Alberta politics these days, and there seems to be a really strong grassroots movement among the people fighting back against the NDP policy, and it seems to be a movement that's growing, and a lot of these things correlate into the things that you were talking about that resonates with me anyway. What's your thought on that the people trying to regain the power that they feel that they're losing?
Well, you know, there's a line in Chesterton's Ballad of White Horse. It's about Alfred the Great, and at the darkest time when the Danes are overrunning the kingdom and burning and slaughtering everywhere. And Chesterton has the Virgin Mary appear to Alfred in a vision and say, I have not for your comfort, not for your desire, save that the sky grows darker and the sea grows higher. And in a sense, that's where you are. Trouble besets you at all sides, but it's very instructive what's happening. People who thought that it didn't matter what the government did. People who thought the parties were all the same. People who thought the principles of liberty didn't really matter are now being shown by reality how important these things are. This creates a moment, a kind of a Lord send me such enemies moment, to be able to tell people what's wrong in this country is government is too big. There is almost no problem. Milton Friedman said, I challenge you to name one problem in the United States that doesn't come from excessive government. And then we can say, and so the answer must be less government. We've tried every way to make government bigger. We've tried every restructuring plan. We've tried every new vision. We've tried every exciting trend. None of it's worked. Let's try having less government. Let's have government do fewer things. I met George W. Bush when he was just a candidate for the Republican nomination in a gym in New Hampshire with a bad band blaring. And I said, I have a question for you that I've asked a number of leading Canadian conservatives, at least nominally. Can you tell me something government is doing that it shouldn't be? Not that it should be doing differently or a different level, it just shouldn't be doing. And Bush said to me, that's a really good question. I'll have to get back to you. And of course, he never did. I don't mean he never phoned. I wasn't expecting him to phone. I mean, he never vetoed a spending bill in 8 years in the White House. So if you're going to learn from what's happening in Alberta, you need to learn that it's not about political tactics. It's not about some populist promise to give more money to the right people and less money to the wrong people. It's about government being too big and being unable to deliver on the fancy promises it made or on its basic responsibilities. And that what you need to do is use this as a lesson for people that government needs to be smaller. Because Bob Rae in Ontario was followed by Mike Harris. And at first, Mike Harris thought government should be smaller. Then the Tories decided government should be bigger. And next thing you know, we had the Liberals from here to eternity. Because conservatism actually wins elections. And if it governs in a conservative way, it wins re-election. It's when conservatives veer left, like Brian Mulroney. He won 2 majorities by campaigning from the right. Then he ran huge deficits, shunned social conservatives and destroyed his party. Even now, it kind of works. But this is a great chance to teach people that this is why we shouldn't put our faith in government, because it can't do the things it says, and we can. We can build a prosperous Alberta. We can look after the less fortunate in our midst. We can raise our children properly. We can do all the things that need doing, provided the government doesn't stop us from doing them, sap our energy, nibble us to death with regulations, insult our intelligence and pick our pockets. That is what you use this to show people liberty is right. Liberty is what makes a society great. It's not heartless, it's not selfish, it's not grinding and grasping. Liberty is the freedom to use your money. It's like Margaret Thatcher said, nobody would remember the Good Samaritan if he just had good intentions. He had money. And he chose to use his money to help somebody he didn't even know who was in distress. And does anybody think that Albertans wouldn't do that? That you would turn your backs on the less fortunate if there wasn't this huge government welfare apparatus that is cumbersome and callous, overly expensive, and rewards the wrong things. So I wish it hadn't happened. And times are tough here. Times are tough because of the collapse of oil prices, but times are also tough here because of decades of bad government that just got worse. And that is a lesson that I couldn't conjure up, but it's been handed to you. Use it.
At the risk of exposing my ignorance about Alberta politics, you mean the resistance to this silly bill to unionize your family farms, right? Okay. In Ontario, there was also a big response, grassroots response to a change to the curriculum, sex ed curriculum, that also managed to get it at least stalled for a while. This is great. But there's one thing that's missing from those movements of resistance, of grassroots people saying, hey, no, stop it, you're going too far, is that when the governments back down, as they eventually have to do, then this grassroots movement kind of goes home. Instead of saying, and by the way, here's what we want. We want a smaller government. We want less welfare from the state. We want to take it over. Even if you're not going to get it, it doesn't matter. You need to continue saying what you want instead of stopping right after the immediate crisis is over or at least delayed. That's what I would like to see more of, is saying, and by the way, we also have a positive message of what we would like to see instead of this rubbish, and put it out there and try to campaign for it a little bit, not spend the rest of your life on it, but at least put something out there for the other people who are watching this from the sidelines, say, yeah, kind of sounds okay, I guess, yeah, and get them slowly to consider your ideas as well.
If I could just add that to that as well, and then we'll get to you, Ben, but that's what John's talking about in his constitutional proposal, is to take a look at our Constitution and rewrite it. One of the problems that we've got is equalization. We've spent 200 and some billion that's gone down. It hasn't come back. The Harper government didn't do anything with some of the free trade agreements. They didn't do anything with some of the pipelines. And so to me, as things get tougher, what John wants to be working on is a what would you call it, a rewritten constitution. We'll have a draft constitution that will address some of these problems. So like once everybody said, okay, we've had enough, what else can we do? John and his group are trying to have in place a draft constitution that would replace that. And then what they would like to see people do is ask their MP for a referendum. We can't force them to bring it in, but if enough people ask their MP to have a referendum on this draft constitution, you would at least get everybody talking about it. So Brigitte is absolutely right. We've got a whole lot of people that have, you were part of the group Stop the NDP. There was a lot of the Bill 6 protests. There's a lot of people have become active, but now we need to be, once we're aware, we need to start looking at what options do we have to give the people as they get involved. What are we going to suggest be done? And to a certain extent, it's going to take patience, because it'll take until 2019 to get some of it done. It'll take longer than that to get some of it done, but John is trying to put in place some alternatives that we can circulate to people and say, this is a solution that would help with some of these problems. Ben, your turn.
Thank you very much, John and Brigitte, for coming here and for your comments. Brigitte, when you were speaking earlier, you said we should be speaking with our hearts and perhaps not always with our minds. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, the famous words about beat their swords into plowshares and their shares into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. when you talk about guns and you say the other side mentions or uses their hearts, do they not appear to be bringing this prophecy to life? So how would you talk to someone about guns from the other side? And John, my question to you is, what would be your answer to the question you gave George Bush? Thank you.
Sorry, did he answer the question of what?
To the George Bush question.
Okay.
What shouldn't they do? Yes, yeah.
How I would talk to someone about guns, and not just guns, by the way, self-defense in general, and the tools that people might, personally, I'm not a gun person. I do hand-to-hand, and because I always have them with me, right, my feet too, and I'm pretty good at them, using them. Don't suggest anyone who wants to try. Self-defense and the tools that everybody should have the right to decide which tools you want to use for your self-defense. Look, you're a woman, you're in a city, or anywhere for that matter, if you have never once in your life thought that some creep was after you, even if you're wrong about it, right? Everybody's had that experience or knows somebody who's had that experience. Some people had the experience of being jumped by someone. I almost got jumped by 2 guys on meth once in downtown Ottawa, going to work for Sun News very early in the morning. I got out okay. But some people don't. Use that because that too is a very, very strong emotion. The fear of having someone grab you or your child or anyone you love. And you're defenseless and the state thinks that you should just wait for the cops to show up. Well, what if they don't show up right now? I was actually in downtown Ottawa. That's pretty, cop friendly, right? There's a lot of them around. I called them right away as soon as I managed to get into my building. It took them at least, I think, 5 or 7 minutes to get there, which was a pretty good response. But against 2 guys, if they had decided to jump me instead of walking away when I stared them down, they would have found me with my cell phone in my hands, or maybe not even that, right? Use that. Why is it that the state right now tells me that I don't have the right to have tools in my handbag to fight back if someone should attack me? Because that's actually the law right now. That's also an emotion, to be left alone, defenseless. Fight that. You should be allowed to fight back and to use the tools that you think you can handle to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. After that, my answer is going to be somewhat dry, even if I try and make it somewhat vivid. I believe the government should not be subsidizing businesses. When I was asking, I got to ask my question of 3, it was 2 party leaders, Preston Manning and Jean Charest, and Lauren Nystrom was there for the NDP, and I asked him that question, and the only guy who could answer it was Lauren Nystrom, was the socialist, and he said, no subsidies to business. And I thought, it's enough to make a man hang himself with his Adam Smith tie, when only the socialists can shrink government. But there are all kinds of other things. The government should not be making elaborate rules for safety. It should have the common law of tort if a product is unsafe. It shouldn't be telling you your railing should be 42 inches, not 41 inches. The story everybody hears. We were having a small renovation done on a very small cottage, and the inspector showed up, and instead of looking at the new stuff, he complained that the 39-year-old railing was an inch too low. And we had to stop work, pop off the cap rail, put in a 1-inch piece of wood, and put the cap rail back on. It isn't stronger, it isn't safer, but it's checked off by the bureaucrats. The government should not be subsidizing agriculture. How's that for Alberta? But it shouldn't. There should be no supply management. There should be no egg marketing board. There should be no rules against Uber. The government should not be in the medical business. The government is not a doctor. We should be looking after one another. We are wealthy enough to create charitable health foundations. Health spending is over 40% of every provincial budget, and it's rising fast. It's going to bankrupt the state. And then where are we going to be? It's appallingly inefficient and callous. If you were told that there was no more socialized medicine, but your taxes were going down 40%, and now it was up to you, would you say, ha, too bad? Of course you wouldn't. There's not a chance in the world that you would do that or that your neighbors would do that. We would rise to the occasion and we'd become better people for doing it. The government should not I mean, there are so many things. It shouldn't be making adults wear bicycle helmets. It shouldn't be requiring us to carry a buoyant heaving line and a flashlight in our boat, even if it's the middle of the day and we're alone in a canoe. The government shouldn't be mandating what kind of labels appear on food. You are adults. You can talk to the supermarket and the food maker about what you want to know about what's in there selling you, what's in the stuff they're selling you. There is absolutely no need to require restaurants to put nutrition information on menus. The government is meddling in so many areas. The government should not be providing education. The government should, as John Stuart Mill said, be ensuring that all parents can afford to educate their children, and it should punish parents who do not see to their children are educated for child abuse. But the money should go to the parents to educate the children the way they see fit. The government in Victorian England, somebody once asked Milton Friedman what's the right size for government, and he said historically it's about 10%. The government right now takes over 40% of GDP, and then you add in tax expenditures, it's another 10% of GDP, those loopholes that Stephen Harper was so proud of. He's now subsidizing not only my kids' art class, but also my home renovation. Why is the government picking your pocket so I can fix my patio? What possible public benefit is there in that? It's just plunder, and the fact that I'm also being plundered to fix your patio so that all the people who can afford home renovations benefit at the expense of all the people who can't. This is outrageous, and it's wackily inefficient. The government should be protecting us from force and fraud, defending the realm, ensuring honesty in weights and measures. That's the kind of thing the government should be doing. It should not be doing 3/4 of what it is doing. It doesn't need to do it. We're not better off because it does it. We're worse off because we're not idiots, and the common law and the right to sue people for negligence or malfeasance protects you from virtually all the things that government regulation supposedly protects you from, and generally does an awful job. Remember when the government told us eggs were going to kill us? When the government started telling us to stuff ourselves with grains and avoid that dreadful red meat? The government shouldn't have an opinion on what I'm eating. Even if it's a sensible opinion, the government shouldn't have an opinion on what I'm eating. That is not the role of the state. Not King John never thought of telling his subjects to avoid fat. It's a very long list. The government should not be doing most of what it's doing. And again, it's not to create a dog-eat-dog society. It's to create the society that existed. I said Britain didn't have compulsory education until 1870, but they had enormously high rates of literacy because the English cared about their children. And of course, when people got to Canada, they set up schools. It's one of the very first acts of their common life. They didn't need to be told to set up schools. And then the government eventually came along, took over the education, and started teaching the children nothing but recycling and creating illiteracy. You know, this common thing. Take a textbook from 1912 intended for grade 3 and see if your grade 7 or 8s can do it now. The government's made an appalling mess of that. And whoever thought, John Stuart Mill said, if the government doesn't just fund education but delivers it, it will turn into indoctrination. And that's exactly what happened. And that's one of the major reasons they've chased these stories out in favor of this unreadable dreck that doesn't have character development or depth or a sense of human frailty or proper grammar or the history of the country. So that is my brief answer to what the government shouldn't be doing, most of what it's now doing.
Yeah, there's a better one that he did this weekend, just I think by fluke. He said that government can be small because Canadians are big. And I think that's a good slogan. And I would add, the government in this country can be small because Canadians are competent, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I like that one.
Justin, did you have a question? Is that what you walked down for? Sure, go ahead.
John, I got a question for you about historical relativism. It was John A. Macdonald's 201st birthday last month, and there was certain groups that really protested that we would celebrate his birthday at all on the grounds that he was a drunkard and a racist and all this kind of stuff. But can we really hold historical figures or even organizations from the past to the same standards that we do people in the present day?
Just ask if everybody heard the question before.
Did everyone hear the question? You say a lot of people criticize Sir John A. Macdonald for being a drunkard, for being a bigot, for having a number of failings that today we take very seriously. And he's asking, can we really judge historical figures by contemporary standards? And My first thought on historical relativism, when he was a very old man, the former Premier of France, Clemenceau, was asked what he thought that people would say in the future about responsibility for the First World War. And he said, I don't know what they will say, but I know they will not say that Belgium invaded Germany. And there is an irreducible reality to history of things that did and did not happen. If we intend to judge the past by our standards, the thing is we must be ready to have the past judge us by theirs. And I mean that in this sense. Among the courses I've taught at the University of Ottawa is slavery in the United States. And I say to my classes, we all understand now that slavery was a great evil. We are going to be open-minded in this class, but I don't think there's going to be a constituency saying, you know what, maybe that wasn't that so bad. And I say, you all think if we'd lived in 1850, we'd all have been abolitionists. We'd all have been fiercely determined. But statistically, it's not true. You know, a quarter of you would have supported slavery, maybe 5 or 10% would have opposed it, and the rest would have wished everybody would shut up because they didn't like to think about it. And then I said, how will the posterity judge us on the issue of abortion? Are you sure we're any better off? But all of this relies on the fact that there is right and wrong. And that I understand that in a society where slavery is widespread, a lot of people will fail to see that it's wrong, but it still is wrong. And the people who did see that it was wrong deserve our admiration for standing against the spirit of the times and saying, no, this is a horrendous evil. And just as when I'm told, shut up about social values, don't talk about abortion, we got to win the next election. And I say, that doesn't quite rise to well done, thou good and faithful servant, does it? I mean, what's really more important? Defending the lives of the unborn or cutting the corporate tax rate by 1%? But when you look at John A. Macdonald, yeah, he drank a lot, but you know, he did a better job drunk than a lot of people would do sober. He still should have drunk less. You know, people knew at the time that excessive drinking was bad, and it was bad. He had, in some respects, he had quite enlightened attitudes on the subject of race. Others were not so enlightened. And I think while you excuse some of what he thought because he was a product of his times, you still say that those rare individuals who really were not bigoted, even in those times, were more admirable. But it's like Tommy Douglas. I once wrote a thing for the Western Standard when Ezra Levant was publishing it on Tommy Douglas, because in his youth he was an ardent eugenicist. And I managed to get hold of the notes from his master's thesis where he wanted to sterilize the feeble and all that kind of stuff. And it's bad stuff. It really is bad, even though it was pretty common in those days. And incidentally, you know, nobody cares about Tommy Douglas's notes. If this was the United States, even if it's embarrassing, they'd be enthusiastic. I couldn't get anybody interested in that. But then Tommy Douglas, as a socialist, a pacifist, and a eugenicist, went to see Nazi Germany. And he came back so horrified that he helped his party break with its leader and vote for the Second World War, and he tried to enlist. In fact, the same bad leg that got him interested in socialized medicine kept him from being sent to Hong Kong with the Winnipeg Rifles and almost certainly dying there. Tommy Douglas deserves our admiration, not for his economic policies, but for having been a eugenicist, gone to Nazi Germany, and changed his mind. So, yeah, we can, because truth doesn't change with the passing of the centuries. Stephen Langton is a man who commands our unqualified admiration to this day, even though he lived before any of the modern technology that we take for granted, even though he lived under social conditions that were unimaginably different than our own, because he stood for liberty. He stood up against the king for the Pope, and then after the Pope sided with King John and wanted to excommunicate the barons, Langton refused to read out the excommunication. He was exiled from England by the Pope, but he outwaited the whole thing and came back, and by golly, he rallied people to force Henry III to reissue Magna Carta. So we do understand that people are a product of their times, but it's not a get out of jail free card. Not for the people we like, not for the people we don't like. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the one who said all men are created equal, was a slave owner. What's worse, he had a slave mistress. He said terrible things about blacks, and then he went home and he went to bed with his black mistress. And for that, he deserves our condemnation. He was not just a racist, he was a hypocrite. And it doesn't matter that it was the 18th century to me. He was a villain. And I'll tell you another Jefferson story, by the way. When he was an old man after he was president, a rich young Virginian named Edward Coles came to him and said, I have a proposal for you. I suggest we both free our slaves. Because if I free my slaves, people say, wow, that's amazing. He was a rich guy and he gave it away. That's kind of cool. But you're Thomas Jefferson. You were president. You wrote the Declaration of Independence. You founded the University of Virginia. If you free your slaves, we may be able to set this institution on the path to extinction. And Jefferson said no. He said, we can't. We're holding the wolf by the ears. It's not safe to let go. Washington freed his slaves in his will, but Jefferson stumbled and fell at that gate. And you know what Edward Coles did? He freed his slaves anyway. He took them to free territory. He later became governor of Illinois. Coles made the right call, and Jefferson made the wrong call. And I think that even though we know that times were different, even though we see that there are mitigating circumstances in Jefferson's attitudes then compared to what we'd think about somebody who talked like him today, having weighed it all, we find him guilty of helping to perpetuate an institution that plunged his nation into civil war and denied basic rights to millions of human beings, not just before the Civil War, but for almost a century afterward. He cannot be excused that. And so in the end, I say, we see some things much more clearly than posterity, but we don't get much credit for it. Not being racist today isn't a real mark of distinction because it's so common. It's still a good thing, but we don't get to be extraordinarily enlightened for it. I think in the modern era, standing up for the unborn gets you more credit because they will all move away from you there on the bench. That is going to earn you ridicule. And it's funny, when I said this in class, one student said, what about animal rights? And I said, of course, I don't know what posterity will say. Maybe they'll condemn us for our attitude toward animals and applaud us for abortion. But I don't think so. I think the law that's written on the human heart tells us that the unborn should be protected, as it once told us that people of different races were our brothers and sisters. So it can be harder given the times, not just for them back then, but for us today. There are things we don't see as clearly as our ancestors would have. We see these things in Ottawa, by the way, these kids in daycare holding onto a rope and being towed around. I find it heartbreaking. And I think that people 100 or 200 years ago would have found it heartbreaking. And so you can kind of understand people today don't see quite what's wrong with this as clearly. And so we get some excuse to some extent for the things we cannot see because they are so common. But in the end, we're all answerable for knowing right from wrong. So was Sir John A. Macdonald, so was Stephen Langton, and so were those who supported King John. They were wrong and they should have known it.
That's about as short an answer as John can give to a history question. And but their whole family is a wealth of information and a wealth of education. We've pointed out, we were all at a conference this weekend, and on Saturday morning I was standing in the breakfast line with their 5-year-old daughter, and she was standing in front of the chocolate and white milk. And I said, can I pour one of those for you? She said, no, I'm trying to decide which one to have. So I said, well, eeny, meeny, she interrupted me, said, no, she said, eeny, meeny, miny, mo is a fixed game. She said, it's always the opposite of how you start. I said, well, she said, like, you can't figure out anything that way. They're they're a family full of information. Do we have any more questions? I'm not trying to cut it short. We have a few more. Let's take one more question if anybody has one. Otherwise, we can just, is there any more questions? Well, go ahead. Yeah, Ben, thanks for coming, and by all means.
Thank you. John, you did say a fair bit about tort law and how individuals should be able to take matters into their own hands. This week, there was a report that a lot of the chicken which comes from China turns out to be fox meat and some other meat, which has just been spiced up nicely, and apparently everything tastes like chicken when it is deep fried. How would an individual in of themselves be able to take on such an institution? Don't you think there is room for good people to have these rules set out and the systems to protect the greater majority from the abuse by such big companies who would literally feed us foxes for chickens? Thank you.
Well, I should mention, by the way, when Columbus sailed to the New World, one of the species he encountered was iguana. They cooked it and ate it, and he said, it tastes like chicken. So everything does taste like chicken. But I think it's fairly straightforward. It just takes one person to discover that this is fox meat, to have it tested, and then a class action suit against the company that didn't take care of where it was sourcing its meat, and the companies will start taking care. Because surely we all know at this point that the Chinese economy is riddled with fraud. That quality is a nightmare in the People's Republic of China. You don't buy it without checking. And as soon as one or two people raise money and launch that suit, all the companies are going to smarten up, and not just about the chicken meat. But at the moment, one of the things we have to do is simplify the legal system, because that lawsuit could go on for 7 years with spurious motions of discovery and delaying tactics. And, you know, the lawyers are getting paid anyway. The prosecutors are getting paid in criminal cases. The judges are getting paid. They're all making money no matter what happens. And we need to make that system, as Magna Carta said, no delaying justice. But tort law can absolutely make corporations terrified of serving people spiced fox.
Tell you what else does. Facebook, Twitter, social media, right? If you say grocery store X sold me fox meat instead of chicken, they will want to shut this down real quick and say, well, it wasn't us, it was the distributor. And they'll turn around and sue the distributor, who will turn around and sue whatever, all the way up the chain. And they won't wait 7 years because the lawyers get paid to get this off their back. They will want to fix that because everybody on Facebook is going off with, hey, grocery store X is selling us fox meat. That's their worst nightmare. Use that. It's free, right? Facebook is free. Use it.
It's another opportunity for individual initiative, isn't it? Absolutely it is. Well, thank you very much for coming. John's family were with us all weekend. Their 9-year-old daughter, Catherine, we started, you saw her earlier, we started calling her their VP of marketing. We asked her up at, I guess it was at noon on Saturday, and we said, Catherine, tell us how the marketing is going. She said, well, the marketing is going well, but it would be a lot better if we had more sales. So, like, do me a favor, do that sweet young girl a favor. They have the books, they have the DVD on the Great War Remembered, and they have the documentary on the Magna Carta. Some of you that have kids in schools, think about buying that package of the Magna Carta book, the two DVDs, and donating them to your high school library or school library. This is the kind of information. It's sort of I guess it's a work of love for you folks, but at the end of the day, they still do like to eat beef and stuff like that. Good Alberta beef, that's exactly right. And so please take a look at that. One of the things that John touched on, we mentioned where we spend our money. It takes the unions in Canada raise about $3 billion a year in union dues, which one of the things Harper had brought in was some accountability legislation. Mr. Trudeau is going to repeal that, so we're not going to have any idea where that $3 billion is going, but you can be very sure that there won't be, in all likelihood, it will cause some concern for some of the things that we're working on. So think about that. We've got the Conservative movement spending about $13 million, and we're fighting against at least $3 billion of money that may well be working against us on a lot of issues. One of the speakers at our conference the other day, she said, her name is Val Price. She's the head of ACT for Canada, and she said, being born free is an accident, living free is a blessing, and dying free is a duty. And Brigitte mentioned earlier, I always quote Pericles, but then usually John Robson isn't standing to the right, so I'm gonna quote Pericles, and if it wasn't him that said it, John, I guess you'll tell me who really did. But Pericles, at some point in time, said, when you look out over this great country that we love, remember that it was built by men who knew their duty and had the courage to do it. If he were saying it tonight, well, for one thing, he'd be awfully old, but for another thing, he would probably say men and women who knew their duty and had the courage to do it. But think about that. We look out over this great country that we all love. I think John has done a pretty good job, and Brigitte have done a nice job tonight. I shouldn't say a pretty good job. They've done a great job of articulating what our duty is, and they've also articulated very well some of the things that you can do to do your duty. So I commend you all for being here, because it's a good start down the road to doing your duty. But I thank you for being here. I'd ask you to consider buying some of their DVDs. John, if you look at his, is it johnrobson.com? .ca. He also has a spot where you can become a patron and donate $2, $4, $5 a month. But the point is, and we had a speaker again at our conference saying there was, 3 million Conservatives. If they all donated $2 a month, it would be $6 million a month, $72 million a year. It would certainly be a lot more money for Conservative causes than what we've got now. So take a look at his johnrobson.ca. Consider being a patron for a couple of bucks a month, because it truly does add up, doesn't it? As the Texas senator said, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you've got real money. So thank you very much for being here. John and Brigitte are going to be around for a while if you'd like to buy a book. If you'd like to just, I guess we'll all go up to the foyer and we'll just mingle, and hopefully a few people will buy a book. But thank you very much for coming out, and good night. Thank you. Nicely said.